All right. Welcome everyone. This is session number 4 of the HISTEPS seminar series, and we are very eager to welcome today Silke Körber, who is currently an external research fellow at the Vienna Circle Institute, where she spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow and also published her dissertation in one of their series. She did her PhD in philosophy at Humboldt University in Berlin, and previously she studied German studies, political science, communication, and book history at Free University, Berlin, and in Mainz. She worked also for the Interdisciplinary Excellence Cluster TOPOI in Berlin. And in addition, Silke also held several editorial positions in publishing, and she worked for museums and cultural institutions such as the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, Humboldt Forum, and the Berlin International Film Festival. So we are very happy to welcome her today and to listen to her talk, which is titled "Different Shades of Scientific Humanism." Now I'm giving the floor to Silke, just after reminding that the talk will be about 45 to 50 minutes as usual, and there will be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So stick with us. There will be time to exchange ideas and for having a conversation. So without further ado, over to you, Silke.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matteo. I'm very happy to be here today talking about scientific humanism and some of its varieties in the 20th century. And this is especially against the backdrop of current crises and conflicts in which standards of rationality as a basis for sound and ethical decisions in politics and civil society are questioned or under massive attack. And it's no coincidence, I think, that against this background there has been increasing interest in this subject. For example, recently Anjan Chakravarty's book on science and humanism came out, and in fact these debates on climate change, on AI ethics and genetic engineering are essentially based on debates about scientific humanism, how we use our scientific knowledge to make responsible decisions, not just for individual agents, but also for groups and humanity as a whole. But what exactly defines scientific humanism, also in contrast to traditional concepts of humanist thinking? And in my paper, I will highlight, first of all, if you can scroll down a bit, Matteo, I will highlight some general tendencies of neuroscientific humanism, trying to identify similarities, differences, focusing on ideas and practices of critical thinking and collective well-being underpinned by rationality, rules, attitudes, as well as socio-political aims and values. So my talk is roughly structured into 4 parts. I will say something about the historical background, some features and transformative concepts. Then I will move to some key actors and groups that can be associated with a new kind of humanism. And after that, I focus on general attitudes and values. Finally, I wrap up with some thoughts about limitations that mainly came up during the changes of the political, social, and economic landscape after the Second World War. So, for the features, Matteo, if you could scroll down a bit again. Sorry, we have to do that because of technical difficulties. So in the 1920s and 30s, in particular, a left-wing and liberal-minded elite embedded in various philosophical groups and movements in society, but also in the context of internationalist movement, increasingly advocated the combination of strong, comprehensive humanism and scientific rational thinking. New concepts and standards in contrast to traditional humanism as we understand it, and I don't have time to go into that in this context. So these new standards of knowledge transfer and popular education emerged in many places, and they were intended to promote the formation of modern democracies and an egalitarian world society in the face of dictatorship, the spread of political propaganda and manipulation in political establishment and the sensationalist media. So modern science was supposed to help gain and convey a clearer and more coherent worldview, and at least this was the hope of many intellectuals, journalists, writers, publishers, and scientists across Europe and the US. So, even though those concepts are in general also based on open-minded humane thinking that could be traced back to at least Renaissance or Enlightenment, I have listed some key features that are centered around ethics, reason, compassion and flourishing of life, rejecting supernatural explanations for humankind and society. And especially in 20th century, humanist thinking was primarily associated with an internationalist and global agenda, the establishment of cooperative groups and institutions such as the League of Nations and later the United Nations, and the enormous advancements of contemporary science as a guide for modern life and for the common good. So these concepts, as you can see here, were based in contrast to classical humanism on empirical research and scientific findings, a general scientific attitude applied not just for the educated elite, but also for the general public and citizens in democratic societies. So could you scroll down, please? Right, so this might be surprising, but especially the achievements in science and technology had permanently changed Europe during the 18th and 19th century, the scientific age, as Werner von Siemens had called it, and this ongoing process of professionalization, standardization, and specialization in the sciences was significant, and at the time promoted both the crisis and reorganization of the educational and academic system. And the gain of knowledge in the positive sciences was not matched by comparable achievements in the humanities. This applied in particular to philosophy, understood by Kant and Wilhelm von Humboldt as a leading discipline or foundation of the sciences, and associated with a new humanist ideal of education. And the works of Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt already marked the transition of this kind of worldview, were an important point of reference to all the scholars and scientists that I will now introduce to you, either explicitly or implicitly. And that is from the idea of that the structure of the language determines how we understand the world, to empiricism, to the free development of the individual through education, to global science and citizenship, to in general holistic worldview. So another scroll down, please. So there are a couple of developments under the name of new humanism, scientific humanism, secular humanism, and evolutionary humanism, that all are kind of connected or used interchangeably or linked in the argumentation of the groups and agents that I will introduce. And although there are differences in the conceptual framework, they share a certain core and values and ideas, like they are methods of rational planning that also protect human rights and the freedom of individuals. They want to achieve a scientification without succumbing to this temptation of assuming something like a simple linearity of development in science, the belief in never-ending progress, and the belief that scientific thinking and arguing need to be implemented in education and communication, not just for, as I said before, the intellectual elite, but also for the general public. And that all was connected to making plans, strategic plans for global democratic future and international community. There are other groups that I, for the sake of time, limited time, will leave out here. I just name one, the Love Warsaw School, with, for example, the Polish philosopher Maria Ossowska, who was connected to Bertrand Russell and Susan Stebbing also. And she referred to her ideas as open humanism based on logical analysis, empirical observation and skepticism toward dogmas, but that's very close to what I'm going to talk about now. So the next slide, please, has the key figures and connections that I will talk about now. So, as you can see, George Sarton, Susan Stebbing, Otto Neurath, Julian Huxley, John Needham, and John Dewey. And they all were somewhat interconnected, influenced by each other or referred to each other's work. And I will partially go into that, but I will now point out some points of reference of these agents to Humboldt's ideas as well. So Neurath, who by the way studied at what was later called Humboldt University in Berlin, and referred to especially Alexander von Humboldt's work, Cosmos, for his visual educational projects a lot. He was directly involved in this academic environment that was shaped by Wilhelm's university reforms and by the focus on universal language, unified science, and the ideal of a democratic versus elitist education. So Sarton used Alexander von Humboldt's work as a historical foundation and moral example for humanistic science. He saw him as one of the old masters who already embodied the universal understanding of knowledge that Sarton wanted to institutionalize for the modern world. And Sarton's general educational concept of new humanism is inconceivable without the educational ideas of Wilhelm von Humboldt. Sarton, on the other hand, is directly connected not just to Neurath and the Vienna Circle, but also to Needham, Huxley, and the UNESCO, and I will go into that a bit later. The UNESCO itself, here represented by Julian Huxley, the first Director General of the UNESCO, and John Needham, is often described as the organizational implementation of Humboldtian humanism in the 20th century. So, while the Humboldts laid the theoretical foundation for linking education, freedom, and global understanding, the UNESCO created the political framework to promote these ideas worldwide, something that was later recognized in a formal setting as well. So now I will come to Sarton. Matteo, if you could scroll down. So his work is really a very important milestone in the development of 20th century humanism. by him called, first of all, New Humanism, but also later referred to as scientific humanism. Otto Neurath named Sarton a couple of times in his own works. And I mean, he's probably known to all of you. I just give some kind of details. He's called the father of the history of science, studied philosophy, chemistry, and mathematics in Ghent, and obtained his doctorate in mathematics before emigrating to the US at the outbreak of the First World War, where he taught history of science at Harvard and founded the History of Science Society and the journals Isis and Osiris. So in his standard work, that is the History of Science and New Humanism, he summarizes his thoughts on the role of natural sciences and humanism and argues against old-fashioned humanists. On the one hand, an uneducated man of science and technology on the other, pointing out that the former are essentially incomplete without the natural sciences, and he also warns that human life on this planet would have no meaning without history, philosophy, art and literature, and without a living religion. So towards the end of the book, I'm not going to read everything here, he describes this new kind of humanism as scientific, and I read: the new realization of the richness of our past, which is thus opened to us, this new evaluation of the continuity of human efforts and our heritage of science and wisdom, that is humanism, through the new kind, though the new kind of it, including science instead of excluding it, scientific humanism. And we need to be taught our life in this new kind of spirit and improve, including all of these elements together. And Friedrich Stadler outlined already in 2018 that Sarton was strongly influenced by Ernst Mach before his emigration to the US and connected to the Vienna Circle and the Unity of Science movement as well. So another person Neurath referred to in his Modern Man in the Making, and who is actually joined in most of his activities in exile, is the British analytic philosopher Susan Stebbing, and I come to that now. So Neurath and Stebbing corresponded and cooperated for over a decade, from the 1930s onwards. And despite some programmatic differences, and I don't have time to go into that now, they agreed that the role of philosophy, science, and scientific expertise needed to be reconsidered, and that the formation of modern democracies and global society had to be actively promoted. For this purpose, it was necessary to find new techniques of knowledge transfer for the general public, but also train people in critical thinking and in the judgment of facts and data. And this was called some kind of independent questioning attitude in dealing with institutions, politics, and the media. The requirements of the transfer of knowledge were defined and formalized, and it was connected to questioning the unlimited authority of scientific experts, as well as the absolutist ideal of science at the time in favor of a more pluralistic approach. So I cannot really go into the biographies, but it is striking that Stebbing and Neurath were connected and interested in general education and a broader scientific approach. They joined groups for humanist goals and better scientific practice, and Stebbing, for example, was the first female president of the Humanists UK, and both also criticized in their writings scientists and representatives from politics and the media who were engaged in emotionalized knowledge transfer and made contact instead with internationalist movements who shared their ideas and values. So already in Vienna, Otto Neurath had developed these kinds of ideas and connected them to a project called Isotype, which is basically the pendant to the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, which is the scientific arm of his extremely volatile and broad activities in exile. And these are basically two levels of his activities in exile as well. If you could change to the next slide, please. So the development of Isotype, symbolic language based on conventions with a higher conic quality, showing social, technological and historical connections in pictorial form, is basically characterized, on the other hand, by the same beliefs or the same structure of scientific exchange that he advocated in the Unity of Science movement. And this was executed in publications, in exhibitions, films for the common public, and distributed internet worldwide as far as that was possible during the Second World War. So Otto Neurath mentioned and was deeply connected to Humboldt's work, but he was also connected, as Adam has mentioned in his talk, to the leftist and intellectual scene in Britain, like the Warburg Institute, the Fabian Society, the Scientific Mass Observation, planning for already the post-war socialist society that they envisioned, and was joined by intellectuals like Bertrand Russell and Julian Huxley, for example, that championed this combination of scientific ethics and social technical planning. And Neurath had also cooperated with Julian Huxley on several book publications. So as you may know or might expect, please to the next slide. Scientific humanism was also a common frame of reference, and I'm going to keep that very short here, in the Vienna Circle, as Anna Siegelsleiter has pointed out in her works. And the main claims and goals were addressed already in the famous manifesto about the scientific worldview in 1929. But many years later, in 1963, Kahner prominently described the program in his intellectual autobiography and used the term scientific humanism to describe the program of the group. And I have summarized the essential points. So man has no supernatural protectors or enemies. To improve life is the task of man himself. Mankind is able to change and improve the conditions of life for the individual and finally for humanity. And all deliberate action presupposes knowledge of the world. The scientific method is the best way of acquiring knowledge. Science is one of the most valuable instruments for the improvement of life. And you can find many of those phrases and claims also in the program of the other agents and groups, and also in the program of the UNESCO, which we will come to in a bit. So this all, as I said, is some kind of a condensed version of that kind of scientific humanism. But another important figure in this context is John Dewey, to which we come now. Matteo, sorry. So he was not just connected to Neurath and Stebbing through the Unity of Science movement and contributed to the encyclopedia, but he was also an advocate of new humanism in the US, and he signed the first Humanist Manifesto of 1933. There he wrote, "What humanism means to me is an expansion, not a contraction, of human life, an expansion in which nature and science of nature are made the willing servants of human good." So, do we believe that science was the best form of inquiry, that knowledge was socially constructed and based on experiences? And for Dewey, science is valuable as a means of helping to accomplish human ends. And this is also articulated in this Humanist Manifesto, which, and in his writings he refers to Humboldt and their concepts a lot, but he was much more a critic, and he sharpened his own more practice-oriented concept that was much more connected to democratic practices, and saw Humboldt as an important thinker, but also one of those idealists who favored some kind of isolated inwardness instead of active social engagement. And we can see from the next slide that this manifesto was completed by two other manifestos, or followed by other manifestos, and they emphasized the importance of the movement over time and influenced non-governmental organizations and international bodies much more. And as you can see, the second manifesto was signed by a group of philosophers and scientists such as Alfred Ayer, Richie Corder, Francis Crick, and also Julian Huxley. And Julian Huxley was a great admirer of Dewey, and the driving force behind the Humanist Manifesto, the second Humanist Manifesto. And he developed these ideas and a much more practical stance, together with John Needham, for which they also used the term evolutionary humanism, which combines a more naturalistic worldview with scientifically based ethics. And this became institutionalized after the Second World War in this very specific organization, which was to be called UNESCO first. But when Julian Huxley became the first director, he added the S to the name, so that it was UNESCO instead, because S was for science. And Matteo, you can scroll to the next slide, please. So he wanted to have science as the central pillar of that organization. And to do that, he appointed John Needham as the first head of UNESCO's Natural Science Division. Together, they worked to establish international scientific corporations in order to secure peace. And the biochemist, semiologist, and historian of science Needham was an admirer of George Sarton, who also supported him as a mentor during this time. So Sarton urged Needham not to view science solely as a European phenomenon, a goal that Needham later perfected with his research on China, but together with Huxley they can be described as an intellectual triangle. Sarton provided the methodological basis for the history of science. Needham broadened this horizon to include the Far East, and Huxley created the institutional framework to make these ideas politically and globally effective. So, in the programmatic paper that Huxley published at the beginning of his, when he was elected, he formulated this as such: the UNESCO's main concern is with peace and security and with human welfare, insofar as they can be subserved by the educational and scientific and cultural relations be based on cultural relations of the people of the world. Accordingly, its outlook must, it seems, be based on some form of humanism. It must also be a scientific humanism, in the sense that the application of science provides most of the material basis for human culture, and also that the practice and the understanding of science need to be integrated with that of other human activities. It must embrace the spiritual, mental, as well as the material aspects of existence, and must attempt to do so on a unitary philosophical basis. So, going on, he explains that no form of religion or ideology or system is capable of providing the basis for modern critical humanism, with many parallels that can be found, for example, in Stebbing's texts. But I hope that kind of counters the impression already that all of them followed some kind of naive belief that science could solve all problems or save the world. But to deepen that impression, I would like to give some very brief, if I still have time, Matteo, some very brief additional comments from Sarton, Neurath, and Stebbing on this subject. So Sarton goes on to define the role of science vis-à-vis other narratives and systems that promise and provide orientation knowledge of some kind, with experts in no superior role, aiming to help and support people. So I read, science is neither philosophy nor religion nor art. It is a totality of positive knowledge, as closely knit as possible. It is as different from practical applications on the one hand as it is from idle theorizing and blind faith on the other. And the historian of science, or the scientist, just interprets science in human terms, explains conflict, and mediates between science and society for humanity as a whole. And the objective is to increase humanity and happiness. So that's the historian of science picture. That next we come to Neurath. So he summarizes his approach in a text with a programmatic title, Visual Education, Humanization versus Popularization. And here the close interaction of scientific worldview, socio-political agenda, and educational program becomes apparent once again. So the transfer of looking at more than one possibility to be prepared to alter statements is the principle of scientific attitude. The social pattern which permits more than one opinion is a democratic pattern. Part of education deals with the evolution of one's own judgment, of a scientific attitude, a quality not restricted to scholars only. There are laymen who have it and scientists who do not have it. The transfer of the scientific attitude is not mainly concerned with knowledge, but also with the creation of a certain sincerity of research and integrity of arguing. So Neurath argues against the popularization of complex scientific content because this would lead only to simplification and falsification. And since experts in certain fields can also be mistaken or contradict each other, the critical examination of specialists by the scientific collective was indispensable. And Neurath summarized it: scientists, citizens should always have enough information to hold the power of the expert in check. And this is very much Susan Stebbing's position as well. And she repeatedly criticized so-called, yes, please to the next slide, repeatedly criticized so-called scientific expert fundamentalists and advocates of religion and their normative ethical claims. And according to her, they offered only unclear or dubious explanations, false advice, and hope for a better future as an excuse not to change the real life situations of people. So she didn't believe in science to replace the political agenda or as a substitute for religion, very much in line with Sarton and Neurath, and rejected the idea of expert as the omnipotent advisor. And for both Neurath and Stebbing, it's very clear that science is always a collective endeavor, and it's not to be confused with the individual scientist also, who is not free of interests, values, and independent of circumstances of empirical evidence. As Stebbing phrases in Philosophy and the Physicists, and I only read a bit here: science is not a goddess or a woman. We cannot ask science, but only scientists. And moreover, we must ask our questions of the scientist at a moment when he is in a scientific temper. And as a misguided scientific attitude, she commented in one of her other texts that Adam and I have just recently published. I agree entirely that the political, social affairs of this world, the scientist has an immensely important part to play in supplying information upon which sound policies must be based. But I entirely disagree that science covers the whole field, and emphatically deny that a scientist, in virtue of his prophecies in a special science, is thereby fitted to rule the world. So, to sum it up, Stebbing agreed with Neurath that about the dangers of technocracy, and emphasized the need to make external interests and considerations visible, especially in communication with a broad audience, in order to support independent judgment of the people. And that was especially in communication with a broad audience, of course. But since to pretend that real science or good science is completely devoid of such connotative dimensions would be to contribute to a very dangerous myth about how science works. It allows the powerful to pursue their own interest through science while pretending to be data-driven. And I think that this is a very modern understanding of how science works, and the role of the scientist should be placed in society. And I'm coming to my concluding remarks and back to the UNESCO, because the UNESCO was very much a new form of scientific cooperation at the time. Science and politics were not regarded as separate activities in a positive framework, because the UNESCO was supposed to favor internationalism, and the general opinion was that all people should have access to scientific progress, that it could control the growth of population, develop natural resources, and bring welfare to everybody. But the demands of the post-war period transformed this instrument into something very difficult to navigate, because more than ever scientists were called to cope with the social implications of their work. And Needham, for example, tried to establish specific structures to support science in the so-called global periphery beyond Europe, but those initiatives encountered numerous juridical and political differences and were perceived as paternalistic. A very fierce debate from 1948 onwards against the so-called UNESCO colonialism started, because in practice international science happened to be contradictory with the national economical exploitation of resources, especially in the so-called global south. And moreover, post-war international institutions promoted teaching of some kind of objective social and natural science for world citizenship that was also connected to capitalism directed by the US. So the Cold War increased the diplomatic conflicts and intrigues and made it very difficult to realize the potential of this kind of diplomatic tool and social remedy that the UNESCO was intended to be, offering a mode of knowledge production that would allow people in diverse parts of the world to understand one another, which was one of the main goals. And during the late 1940s, the Cold War intensified, and the United States government, and to some extent also the British government, moved to marginalize Huxley and Needham, because their scientific humanism and political leanings were seen as too radical, secular, and non-sympathetic too sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And so the departure of Huxley and Needham marked a turning point in the history of the UNESCO, from visionary to a more bureaucratic organization. And it became more of a traditional intergovernmental organization and bureaucracy. And the US wanted to secure the UNESCO as an instrument of Western liberal values rather than bridge the East, bridge the difference to the East, and become a laboratory for socialist and internationalism. So, nevertheless, these two men decisively shaped the identity of the UNESCO for decades, with ongoing publications and projects, and that kind of positive propaganda, for example, that you can see two examples here that have that resemble also Otto Neurath's publications and isotype pictures, which was, by the way, a conscious decision by the by that kind of department that was responsible for the marketing of the UNESCO at the time. And I just want to have a final word about Julian Huxley, in case some of you know that he was also an advocate for some kind of genetic enhancement and manipulation that is connected to this kind of term, evolutionary humanism, which is not to be mistaken with like Nazi politics, but it is some kind of eugenics that he was very much criticized for after he resigned from the UNESCO. But nevertheless, I think it's a very interesting part of that history, and you can find more information on that on this link here, and also on the Humanists UK and American Humanists. And the last word should be on a more positive note. I think with a quote from Susan Stebbing, so in my opinion, our most urgent need today is to know clearly what are the things that belong to our happiness. To know this is to begin to formulate a new way of life, which is the utopianist tradition that is also enclosed in this scientific humanist movement. Thank you.